Socrates. The only true wisdom consists in knowing that you know nothing. That's us, dude. Oh, yeah. Let's bag him. Yeah.
Socrates. Okay, so what's that knowledge of what's truly important called? I guess that would be wisdom, Socrates. Oh, to find happiness, you must have first cultivated wisdom. Tell me how you...
All we are is dust in the wind, dude. Dust. Wind. Dude.
How is Socrates within and without? How is he liminal? How is he monstrous?
Cool. I don't have any Jeopardy this week just because I wanted to get things rolling and we missed so many episodes. So
it's okay. I was just going to answer xenon pollution to every question.
Okay, we'll pretend you got a point. Well, it was nearly a miss for every question, and then one question, it was the best answer ever.
I injured my back yesterday coming back from the cabin, Bruce, and today I'm feeling a little bit better, but I get cocky and think I can make my regular moves, so then I get searing pain.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, the procession and the return have no good advice for back pain, unfortunately. So I guess maybe Bruce, is there so we'll just open this to episode 11 through 14 roughly. Is there anything that was really like outstanding or exciting for you? And then maybe Layman could follow that, and then we'll follow that lead.
Sure. Yeah, I really have enjoyed this recent sequence and surprisingly have been touched and moved by even the pieces on Christian Neoplatonism, which, that I had some early Christian roots and haven't really paid attention to them for a while, but there was some nice pieces in that. I think what really stood out, I really liked his discussion on the generative grammar of reality and the suggestion that reality itself is something like this process of dialectic into dialogos. And I attended a recent conference put on by Greg Henriquez and the Utah Society, and John was in attendance at the talk where Layman and I and others were presenting on integral and other forms of metamodern, spirituality. And I was able to talk a little bit to, the group at that time about John's notion of his cog-sci extension of Aristotle's conformity and how that, connects in his recent After Socrates video on, the dialectic into dialogos as increasing levels of reality realization, not only relevance realization cognitively. So I liked all of that. Maybe that's something we could explore and riff on. And I also really liked his the immediately following video where he was talking about ritual as a way of knowing and the different roles that ritual can play. I think the word he was introducing was synthema and synthematic influence of symbols within ritual space. We really, in our conversations with John on rethinking religion, last several episodes have all been dealing in different ways with ritual as a way of knowing and the role that ritual might play in a religion that's not a religion. So that's an interesting and relevant topic for us. But I really found it helpful in the After Socrates series to hear how he unpacked it in a much fuller way than the way that was showing up in our conversation through just comments. So I got the bigger picture of where he was coming from with that.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the ritual one. I think that's where there's the most still to be discovered around theurgia and synthemata and things like that. I was very happy with episode 14. Like I was happy reading Matt Segal's new book, because a lot of things I've talked with Matt about Whitehead and Nietzsche are in that book. I'm like, great, that's off my plate. There's a lot of things John said in episode 14 where I'm like, oh, those are things I often say. So now I don't have to say those. It frees me up. One thing that stood out to me, maybe from episode 12, but when we're thinking about the parallels between the dialogical structure of reality and the dialogical process of evoking wisdom between human beings, and this sense that there's this interplay between the intelligibility of knowing and the intelligibility of being, often doing is left out of that, right? And it's not that it's not officially included, but knowing, being, and doing as a triad is something that keeps the pragmatic dimension in play. There's being and there's being able. And I would like to hear more discussion about the intelligibility of being able and how that is or is not the same as the intelligibility of knowing or the intelligibility of being.
Yeah, I find both of what you said was really, really spot on for me as well, especially what you just said, Layman, like there's all this awesome being and becoming and contemplation, and then grounding it in the doing, how that works. And I love when John says, like, instead of thinking about, like, let's figure the mind out and then go into reality, let's ask what kind of reality would generate the mind or would generate a moment or things like that. And that kind of, it's like, oh, dialectic makes a lot more sense if the world is dialectically engaging in all of these. Every tree is a being and it's dialectically engaging with the soil and the sun. And then I'm dialectically engaging with society and history and things like that. That kind of co-created spontaneous emergence that happens rather than some other meta perspective, I think is really kind of cool. I'm also now just like dying to know about this Christian Platonism comment, Bruce, and what you thought about the Christian Platonists, because they are some of the most articulate Platonists, but then they use the word God all the time. They, unlike the Neoplatonists, like Proclus. I mean, Proclus's conception of the gods is very pagan, very pantheistic, or I'm not really sure what panentheism is. Maybe one of you two can help me understand the difference, but I think it's somewhere in that realm. And then you look at like Nicholas Acusa or John Scotus Erigena, and they do this dialectic transcendence, but they're always using the word God, and so it's yeah, I'm really interested, Bruce, about that, but that can be very secondary because yeah, the maybe could you say more, Bruce, about the synthemata? Like what did you take away from that aspect of it, and how does or go anywhere else too? I don't want to leave this too much.
Sure. I guess one thing I was thinking about it in terms of, I want to ground it personally before I go into the theoretical part of it, maybe. And I remember in my early days when I took Christianity very seriously, I was in Christian college and I'd grown up Catholic and Episcopal, but I was in a Protestant Christian college, and they had no real place for people like me. I'd often get invited to spaghetti dinners where they were really ambush parties to try to get me rebaptized. But I remember at that time, I found this Episcopal Book of Hours, and it was a way to engage the day at different times throughout the day. Waking up, there were words to say. There was a way to orient towards the unfolding of the rest of the next set of hours. There were places where I could look in the middle of the day towards retreating from whatever was going on and going to the chapel and praying and connecting. And that was really nourishing to me at that time. It gave me a lot of structure. I'd come out of a period of chaos in my home life before that. So this actually gave a lot of structure and a channeling of a connection to something more meaningful, a deeper sense of participating in reality. And I have to say that during that period, as often happens for many people when they're going through a kind of spiritual awakening, you experience a lot of things synchronistically unfolding. You meet the right people, the different kind of thing. You just feel that reality is locking together in some way that's beautiful and transpersonal. It's beyond something that you're trying to will, but you feel yourself participating in this greater unfolding. And that regular practice with the Book of Hours really helped with that. And I really feel that it was almost not even the contents of that, but the structure of that allowed for this kind of feeling of participation. And then after that, for a number of years, I turned my back on all of that. And I went in a much more austere direction, influenced by Krishnamurti and others, and only looking at consciousness and forgetting all the religion, schmeligion stuff, you know. But I remember later when I was in Indonesia living at an ashram, Vipassana ashram, also pretty austere awareness practice there. But the guy who was staying in the room next to me at the ashram had a secret Tibetan altar in there. And I remember looking at that thinking that was so extravagant and ridiculous, you know, and what is he doing with all of that paraphernalia? And that's not getting you any closer to consciousness, you know. But gradually, I actually came to discover the value in that, later going to India and Nepal and becoming involved in the Bun tradition and Dzogchen. And I ended up years later having my own altar and having my own ritual practice. And again, I don't have it now, but I remember it seemed, you know, I like this word generative enclosure. It seemed to establish a kind of generative enclosure out of the day that allowed for a purposeful channeling of intention, attention, and energy, and to connect synthematically to symbols which afforded a glimpse of higher or deeper ways of participating with reality. So that's one of the things that really stood out to me about listening to all that again was those moments actually were nourishing and beautifully informing. And I don't know if I want to return to doing those kinds of things again, but I do like thinking about in our metamodern integral spiritual period of time that, you know, religion, it's not a religion emerging, what kind of structures can be erected in time, in space, that affords that, you know, that interface with the Synthamata in a way that is, you know, I think grounded in cognitive science and useful for us and aligned with, you know, our present psychological understanding, but nevertheless helps us take advantage of the real powers that are present in those traditional practices.
I have a lot of love for the Christian tradition, mostly in its esoteric and communitarian aspects. I've been less focused on the theology in which it takes over a lot of the Neoplatonic ideas. But I've always felt like, you know, to come from a post-Christian culture is to come from a kind of Christian culture. And that there's all these ancestral tendrils that go back through that stuff. So when I was a Buddhist, in order to balance that out, I made a point of going every week to a different religious temple. And most of the ones that were available were Christian. So I've been in ceremonies in, you know, several dozen different Christian sects, deeply influenced by Eckhart and Merton and Kierkegaard and the transcendental mystical stream, as well as really appreciating the role that Christianity has played and still can play in being part of the religionizing infrastructure of civilization. But where it brings me in this conversation is to a couple of areas that the integral discourse can feed into what John's saying. I think one of the areas that can be elaborated here is this: when we talk about these layers, when we talk about how neither emanation nor emergence is itself adequate to explain how this functions, there's a really interesting role there for the way Wilber has conceived of two different modes of reality, the fundamental and the significant, and how those trade off against each other. That the lower levels of emergence are more fundamental but less significant, and the higher levels of emergence that fade into the emanation are more significant but less fundamental, rather than thinking that both those attributes apply either to fundamental emergence or to basic emanation. But the other aspect where I think the integral conversation is really interesting here is this notion that it's valid to use different fundamental linguistic frames on reality. So first, second, and third person is a really simple way to do that. In the Neoplatonic discussion, there's no reason not to do that in the second person, right? It can be the great mystery as if it were a thing. It can also be a personified interlocutor that allows you to have that dialogical process. And that's where it really opens itself up to the Christian theological and mystical traditions.
Could you say more about that, Layman, the integral aspect? I'm not really familiar with the why that would be the second person mystical.
Oh, sure. And it's close to the Ken Wilber quadrants thing. But this notion that you have got these different basic lenses, and these different basic lenses are somehow related to these fundamental different modes that are embedded in natural languages. So we have first, second, and third person framing and phrasing in most human languages, and those indicate basic cognitive modes of experiencing reality. So when you have something like this threading between all the possible edges of knowing, whatever that is, could be a something, could be a self, could be an it, could be an I, or it could be a thou, or it could be a we, could be a shared experience. And so one of the things a lot of the Eastern traditions, with a few mystical exceptions, and some of the Greek traditions don't really do as well as the Christian tradition does, which is think of that as being like an other person. A divine person is engaged in, right? So there's a poetic attunement to the complexity that is the through line of all the edges of the knowing, all those places where the circle and the straight line can't quite be distinguished. All those all together have a convergence, but that convergence is available to human beings in these distinct modes that can be tagged with different grammatical tags. And Christians are not foolish to do it as a me speaking to a great other. That's not a foolish way to do it.
And I was just going to say, I'll add a little parenthetical to that, just to contextualize part of it is, I think integral spirituality and what really was, transpersonal psychology for many years for Ken Wilber, really focused on the East and on Advaita Vedanta and on Buddhism as the valid mystical paths. And so there tended to be an emphasis on either the first person, that you realize some spiritual reality directly within yourself by participating in it and as it, or you relate to the cosmos as this great, unfolding, beautiful it, the cosmic perspective, nature mysticism. But there was not very much emphasis on the devotional, on the I, thou, on a relationship between you and a sacred other like a god. And integral, in Wilber, used to get a lot of criticism that he was really privileging maybe certain forms of spirituality that left out that more interpersonal dimension of human experience. And so I think in part of his reformulation, he really tried to take that criticism in, and he put forward this idea of the three faces of spirit, where we can experience the higher reality, the divine, in a first-person way through our own subjectivity as the higher dimensions of our own subjective capacities and experience. We can experience it as an it when we're beholding the great unfolding order of the world, but we can also relate to it fruitfully as a thou. Whatever this is, that is a presence within our consciousness and is the great unfolding of the world, that in and through that we can find a relationship to an other that puts us in a different way of being and affords different possibilities when we relate to it personally or interpersonally. That's what I would add in that.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
I would
Go
also
ahead.
say that this applies to every what did John call them? Demonstrative references,
Right. Yeah. That's what I was gonna
right?
say.
Right. So that the suchness of anything is not just a thing. It could also be a self. It could also be an other. And when it's an other, it's as if it could speak to you, as if it could care for you. It opens up affective responses that aren't necessarily found in the demonstrative thing. There's also the demonstrative other and every particular demonstrative other.
Yeah, because John talks about the for itselfness of other beings, and you're both kind of saying there's multiple ways to relate to those for itselfnesses, that you're a thou, like this glorious it, or yeah, the I heard someone this philosophy professor on YouTube talk about like I it and I thou, and then she added I relationships, and she used this really good sexual metaphor, and she said like, oh, we're all young once and we just want bodies and we're in it for us, and it's like this I it kind of relationship of dating or of pursuing the other. And then like there's an adult stage that kind of most everyone gets to, where you give some autonomy to both you and the other person and you care about the other person, and then that's the I. And then there's the I thou, when there's this like transcendent function active, um, and the capacity for me to show up and the other person to show up, and then some third thing to transcend, rather than just being these I relationships. And again, like that, John is really claiming that's the ground of being. That's not some like solipsistic, self-deluded point of view. There just are these modes of being in reality because that's the nature of reality, which is kind of beautiful, because then there is a moreness to every person you'll ever meet, and even to yourself. I love Simone Weil says like I'm a mystery to myself, and she means that in the sense that we're talking about with this transcendent sense, and this bottomless moreness, even that my consciousness when it's on myself can keep going into, or it's inexhaustible, which is like a religious message. It's amazing how careful John is to bring in cognition and things like that, but it really always pops out as this like, oh, and now you're in a beautifully religious worldview that is capable of connecting to like the finite and kind of the infinite, in a real way.
Comes back to ritual and to symbol, because when you think of the synthemata, in a way it's like an integration of things that exist at a layer of reality such that they are more than themselves and point to a greater set of patternings. But that can be experienced, like that's a way of holding a ritual symbol or a ritual object as part of the ritual, such that it exceeds itself, that it lurks, that has an entity-like dimension, not only an appreciation of the aesthetics of its excessive coherence, but like the ring in Lord of the Rings, it lurks to the point of having agency. That's when it's really functioning synthematically.
There was something in my mind that just slipped out, but yeah, there was a point in one of the videos where John talked about dialectic into inexhaustibility, where there was this opening up into the discovery of that bottomless moreness. And I was thinking about Raimon Panikar, and one of his comments is, thinking about relating to atheism and theism, and what are the possibilities in the modern world. And he sees atheism as an important and a proper step in the development of our understanding of reality. But one of the things he says is maybe God did die, but God was reborn as the mysterious depth dimension within us and within all things, as the encounter with that ontological inexhaustibility, which I think gets a little bit to, I don't know if it was in 13 or 14, where he was talking about how does this dialectic into dialogos interface with or lead to this, divine learned ignorance. And it's that coincidence with the one, where the one becomes that which you can be, but not that which you can know. And there's only a participation that can't be grasped. There's always this sense of the excess that's beyond reduction to, perceptual object.
Yeah, Christian Neoplatonism and Christianity itself are uniquely good at instantiating the apophatic dimension within their theology, right? Such that even, God is missing, Christ is forsaken. Then they roll the stone away and he's not there, right? There's something deeply in common and deeply conform between that and the atheist and the death of God and the void of God in the world, right? There's different ways to take the affect of that, but there is one way to really appreciate what Christianity is doing, is suggesting a God that can also be the absence of God, because that's the apophatic, the return to the one phrasing of the one many.
Yeah, when you take the New Testament as kind of a mystical text more, it does become confusing to like a literal interpretation of what is receding and presencing itself. And yeah, there's a lot of irony in that. I like this idea that there could be like a present God that dies and then becomes the intermediary for all possibility. That's a very Buddhist kind of Kyoto school interpretation of they're like, come on, Europe, come on, America, figure this one thing out, and then you'll be with us in this kind of no thingness, which again is in Plato. Plato kind of hints at this chiasm of like the apophatic, but there's so much cataphatic in Plato. It's such a grand vision when you look at like the Phaedrus and some of the other, like the Republic, that it's so pregnant with meaning that the apophatic part can sometimes get hidden, even though Socrates is kind of like the king of the apophatic in some way. He's always pointing to like the apophatic underbelly to all permanence. Yeah, that's a really, yeah, I love when Christ, he says like, there will be no signs of me. There will be many false prophets. And you're like, now I can't even perceive you in reality. Like my whole sensible capacity to track you has been weakened by your presence, by your paradoxical presence. Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of humor available in taking it to that degree, right? It's like saying no God created the world and no God determines our destiny and no God underwrites reality. And then you're like, well, this no God is sounding pretty good. Maybe I'll worship him.
That's I think the next New Testament. They need like a funny New Testament, just to add a little bit of that kind of joyous stoic aporia that is so lacking in the suffering of Christ, because you can only get that aporia by going through him, not by just being near him or something like that. It's the stoic joy. I love that. I mean, I got so much spiritual growth out of the concept of stoic joy, because you do that kind of move where you keep detaching from your judgments and your reactions to things, but then you don't lose reality. It's still there. There's always a deeper perception when you step back from your kind of first impression of things as a cynic or a cynic. You've introduced the hard K to my vocabulary here, but it really, like the stoic joy versus like the Christian sorrow, they have so much overlap. I mean, for good reason. Like the idea of providence is in Stoicism, the idea of a unity of the one is in Platonism, but it has just like a, I don't know, there's just a more of a, it really is just joy in the Stoic part. John brought that up in a couple different episodes, and it's like when you let go of some petty pleasure, when you get some spiritual practices and you start attuning to these deeper levels of reality, they're almost reaching into you. You go, oh, this is amazing. I'm in really like a realm that has so much spiritual potential and so much capacity for like deep meaning that like when John brings up these Stoic and Neoplatonic thinkers, like, oh, this is exciting. They've done, like you were saying at the beginning, Layman, they've done a lot of the legwork of these theories and have pushed them pretty far, and they have so much ritual. And then you add these cognitive scientists in like the 20th and 21st century, and these philosophers kind of dusting off the bad interpretations of some of it that were maybe too modern and too literal. And just the Stoic joy of freedom is awesome. Like you could feel joy just witnessing the beauty of reality or witnessing something unfolding, and you're not beholden to some kind of like, oh, I'm a fallen race, I'm full of filth. And in fact, the Stoic world is like full of intelligibility and potential for virtue. I mean, there's virtue all over the New Testament, but it gets kind of minimized in a lot of Western Christian churches, that it's like, oh, wow, I have this whole potential. And if I start doing these practices and having this kind of mindful attentiveness, I can really notice how awesome reality is. And it's in this whole, like John's explicating it so well over these 4 episodes, this idea of that the world is intelligible, that it is good, that it is knowable, and that ultimately, like if you get your life organized, you can kind of have a lot of joy in your experience of it.
There's shallower and deeper ways of understanding suffering, right? And both the Christians and the Stoics are popularly misperceived in a kind of shallow way as being about various kinds of suffering. But what they both have in common at the esoteric practice level is a kind of intentional leaning into sufferings of various kinds, right? The sort of Stoic exercises involve various forms of resistance or placing yourself in opposition to what your impulses might want to do. The Christian takes on the suffering of the world, all the kinds of affective, emotional responses to the things that are imperfect about reality and that are miserable for us. But by leaning into the suffering in certain ways, that affords us a kind of a freedom, gives us access to a different kind of joy, a deeper joy, not a joy in opposition to that suffering, but one which can be accessed by becoming an intentional participant in the suffering, because suffering's happening anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think both want you to live life on its terms and not be deluded. That's certainly true.
And to be able to produce access to, let's call it the Salienzgangsfeld of experience, right? So that when you're suffering, different aspects of your awareness of the intelligibility of existence are in conflict with each other. Part of you is saying this is, and part of you is saying this should not be, for example, or part of you wants to indulge, and part of you is saying no, right? These parts are struggling. But when you enter that struggle and you become a harmonizing factor for those parts, then your experience of them starts to become equally distributed across those systems. And when you have that equal distribution of experience across your subjective systems, you have that Ganzfield effect. There's no particular focus, it distributes. And that is the awakening of this more than, which you can then enter into these various kinds of relationship, I, thou, etc.
I'm thinking about a couple things. One, Jung's distinction between signs and symbols, where the symbol has a kind of infinite yield. It's alive. It's not reducible to a single referent. You can't capture it in that, but that it has this kind of depth to it. And so symbol in that sense is, I think, what's being pointed to with the synthemata. But what's interesting to me is where a religious concept or symbolic element really can function with that, synthematic depth possibility or transcendental possibility, and where it becomes foreclosed and shut down. And I don't know if there's any particular set of circumstances that leads to one or the other, and it might be much more of an intersubjective thing between the individual and the tradition. But I'm interested in looking at that because I can see at different points in my life where the symbols from one tradition or another had that depth and the aliveness to me, and the others were flat and deadening. And if I did a liturgy around them, it would not give me typically that experience of being pulled into something higher or to have any opportunity to realize anything deeper about myself. So just as an example, for instance, a couple examples, maybe one. When I first became involved in the Bun Dzogchen tradition in Nepal, and they have a figure called Tapiritsa. And Tapiritsa was a really beautiful figure for me, just so poetic and evocative to look at the painting or the image of that figure. And it was a delight to meditate on that image and to do guru yoga and different kinds of practices with it. It was opening for a while. But as I went into it, I began to notice, kind of rumbling from my deep unconscious, a longing to relate to the image of Jesus in a particular way, the same way as that, because I felt somehow, maybe because of my own cultural roots and heritage, if the Jesus symbol could come forward in that way, it would actually be richer and more reality revealing, aleithaic for me, if I allowed it to have that role. And that awakened a lot of conflict in me. Especially back then, I wasn't comfortable with my Christian past, but I could feel that there was something there, and there was a deep constellation of affect and feeling and history and resonance that was just much fuller than the symbol that was just more aesthetically appealing from the Tibetan tradition. And so there's that element that the Christian symbol somehow plugged into reality for me in a way that had more dimensions to it. It wasn't just I had a deeper embodied sense of what it meant, even though nominally it was tied up with this notion of suffering. And then later, when I got into the practices of Tonglen or Chud, where Tonglen is, you take on the suffering of others, and Chud is where you allow yourself to be basically dismembered by a goddess, a Dakini, and then fed to the world, including to demons and humans and gods. Your body becomes food and nectar for all beings. It's a shamanic kind of practice with non-dual overtones to it. But I found both of those practices were very evocative of key Christian ideas in terms of Christ taking on the suffering of the world and the communion, his body being offered as food to all beings that would nourish them. And so I began to feel, what would a Christianity be that allowed the practitioners to participate in this more direct participatory way in those symbol sets than having it all handled by somebody over there in the past? So anyway, that's just a kind of a little bit of conceptual landscape there for me. But to me, it brings out that contrast where some symbols have sat flat and dead for me, and others seem to have that affordance for aletheia, a disclosure of some deeper depths of reality and a deeper sense of participation.
There's a really interesting thing here about maybe top down and bottom up use of ritual, right? So that we're all, I mean, I grew up with Salvador Dali's images of Christ. So for me, he's like this semi-transparent, hyperdimensional version of the divine human.
Yeah.
So I always felt like I was seeing through Christ to whatever the Lord per se is. Um, but this notion of some things standing out for you and at some times versus the other ones receding into a flatness has an interesting, there's a query there for people who are in the transcultural position of contemporary people. Because one way is to look at the ritual as saying, this is a given masterpiece, and your job is to make evocative contact with these symbols, regardless of how you feel going in. The other one is to say, well, no, your job is actually to work with the ones that are seducing you, the ones that are standing out to you in particular. That's where your attention should go, right? And in terms of like a bottom up spontaneous generation of how you should be relating to these things out of your own or organic idiosyncrasy, right? So those are both have their value as practices, but it's a situation that most of our ancestors never had to grapple with because they were seldom faced with both.
Yeah, the idea of, of symbols becoming flat and dead, and symbols being really particular to different points in your life. Like we've got such a lack of awesome rituals in our culture that it's almost like confusing how to deal with them at this point. Because I love what you were saying, Bruce. Like the these symbols of like benevolent gods that are I forget the name of there's this Japanese god that's really takes pity on unmarried people, especially unmarried adults. And I remember one time being like, "Oh, I'm so glad that exists. I'm so glad there's a God of mercy that would otherwise judge me as kind of pathetic, but since I'm unmarried, it gives me the benefit of the doubt and it watches my soul and it gives me some grief protection and some like, oh, there's a place for me in this cosmos. That capacity to like be a cosmology for you to see yourself in and to participate in is so profound. It's just like that it's almost like cracking a spiritual egg and being, oh, there's food here to eat. And we just don't have those. Our churches aren't exciting to be in that sense that they don't call you to, I mean, some of them do. Like others, I'm being really like cherry picking the mediocre ones, but like that's what John was saying in the episode is like it's trying to help you know how to spot goodness in the future as well as attain it in the present. And like we're in some sense we're lucky that we can kind of we have all the classics of all the cultures like a type query away, and we can learn about, oh, like I have a friend who loves Celtic mythology and she gets so much out of just interacting with those stories and those symbols and that worldview, where you go to like the American mythology of like work real hard, get a diploma, make a bunch of money, marry someone that was sitting next to you in class, and populate the world with your children. You're like, oh, well, that sucks if that doesn't do it for you. If it does it for you, you're perfect. But if that isn't like a mythology you really feel called to, it doesn't home me where these like foreign gods who I didn't grow up with, I go, oh, wow, that's really grabbing my attention and my eros and my all of these different things, and it homes you, and like it'd be so amazing to help, like again, like John says, like conform to reality, because there is a reality of tragedy and grieving and a reality of coming of age and a reality of like, I love what you were saying, Bruce, about these kind of like micro cosmologies that exist within these kind of ritualized day patterns of monastic lifestyle, where you go, oh, I just pray east 5 times a day and it elevates me up and it grounds me back down, and then I go on through my mundane kind of existence that I think John's kind of pointing to. And yeah, the like the all good all simple one that lets everyone participate in it, that transcends any one time or place, or like beauty, even the conception of like transcendent beauty is like, oh wow, tomorrow I could be struck by the most awesome beauty because it's just inherent in reality. It's just I've learned through these symbols that it exists, and I've maybe learned to track it a little better, and then I can see it in the ritual and then in my day. And there's this kind of dialectic between the two, that my day might bring life into the ritual, and then the ritual might bring life into my day. And it's like, oh, this is ecstatic. This is wonderful. Like, what a cool, like, we can just shove all the cynics and all the nihilists into the river or whatever, and then we'll all go on with these beautiful symbols. And John doesn't really address, at least in these couple episodes, like how a symbol gets flat and dead. I think that's like a deeply like elusive question that I know both of you are tackling on your show with John. But it's like this idea that a symbol can be pregnant for millions and millions of people, and then all of a sudden, kind of like the starter dies, and it's really just not juicing the culture the way it is, not orienting us. Um, is yeah, it's fascinating. Is the power of contact with these symbols to help us grasp reality's nature, um, versus the like they're feeling limp. I was getting a sense when you were saying that, Bruce, that there's this like almost like limpness, like having a father who can't like take care of the wolf outside, or you're like, ah, this is horrible. There's a wolf out there, and my dad's a wimp. This is not who I want protecting my village. So this this idea of how we can have a symbol become like an object to be known and to participate in, and how they might be different at different points in our lives or even in different contexts. Um, I thought was really cool about what was coming
And
out
how
there.
we do that compassionately and in the context of modern family ethics, let's say, because one of the ways we traditionally instantiated a hyper meaningful uniform group symbol was with an excessive imposition of that symbol onto the children from the village, from parents, right? It got beat into you in some ways, or repeated into you constantly, so that for you it was indistinguishable from your experience of the world, from your sense of home, right? There was a lot of roughness involved in that. We don't necessarily want to do it that way. So how do we get together in a more uncontracted form to try to produce similar degrees of access to the sacred?
Sociology like says that you have to overpay to prove yourself to the tribe. There's these weird, like I don't at all want to get into this topic, but like woke culture, like you have to really show that you're woke way more than is probably reasonable, to like be part of the group or whatever that group is. And it's really tricky because you do almost like barrel down on the new members and give them more than they're supposed to have. And yes, how to do that in like a compassionate way. I don't know.
In Chinese culture, at least in some parts of it, it's almost humorous to think about it from traditional Western perspective, but they can fire the gods who are no longer cutting it. There's like a more of a bureaucratic setup, and the gods are like functionaries. And if you see that this god just isn't providing for the village in the way that the god used to, there's ceremonies to fire them and bring in a new one. And that's kind of unimaginable. Nobody can really imagine firing Jesus and bringing in, but in a way, the culture does that. And it's kind of nice that within some Chinese traditions, there's actually a mechanism for that. There's some humor involved in it, and some lightness, but there's also a recognition, I think, that sometimes the symbols go flat, and something needs to be done collectively to bring up something that's re-energizing for the people.
Yeah, it has to be a constant negotiation, and then there has to be shamans in the village, so to speak. There have to be people who are specializing in adjusting which symbols we're using and how we're using them. And if we think of them, like one of the interesting things about synthemata is there's sort of a sense in which many things at a given level are brought together to evoke, to point beyond to another level, right? So this is a dish, it has ingredients. And if you try to make it and some of the ingredients are missing, like the village no longer has access to cumin, you can't quite make the dish anymore. So maybe you have to make a slightly different dish, right? And we do tend to think about these things as if they're unities, as if this symbol and the evocative more than capacity of the demonstrative reference of the symbol, as if that's just a single given. But it also has a manyness. It also has a constructedness in which all of these components need together. And if the people are not having the experiences that go into making that symbol, or they're not being educated in the capacity and discipline to bring things together into that symbol, then I think that's one of the dynamics that causes it to flatten out. However, we have to, like Bruce was saying in his example, really take into account that in a transcultural planetary context, this is going to change throughout individuals and throughout lifetimes. So somebody has to be there to say, it's okay. If you're not that into Jesus right now, that's okay. Maybe you will be again later.
Yeah, I wonder if we've lost our capacity to notice what should be sacred. And like people used to say, oh, this water is the most important thing to our village's survival, or all the mothers. If we don't have any healthy, celebrated, fertile women, then there's no more, Bruce Rob Layman tribe 100 years from now. And we're just like, so it's so top down, we don't realize the bottom up element is missing to start to go like, oh, we should make burning plastics sacred or something, or we should make what I have a friend in Singapore. He said that the Chinese government made a Taoist god of the automobile because they wanted to promote the automobile more. And there's like an argument that it's like the car is kind of sacred in the modern lifestyle. It really does connect like family, government, other nations, all these different things. So it's not just, I mean, it's kind of ridiculous to have a Taoist god of cars, but in some sense, like deciding what should be sacred, like the way the space program was kind of sacred in the 60s, and Kennedy and all of these people were kind of elevating it up, and the youth were just like, oh yeah, we should all be NASA engineers, or STEM is another thing that kind of is sacred to us right now. And like, how do we make being, poor sacred, or how do we make something that didn't exist when Jesus was walking around being deified? Like, something has to have changed since then, or the stories would probably still work. So finding those new sacred things, like I asked John Vervaeke, first I asked him to moo like a cow, and he did, and that was awesome. But then I asked him, like, why are cows sacred? And he was very humble. He said, well, I don't know. It's outside of my expertise. I'm not a cow sacred scientist. But then he said, because they were important in culture at that time. And it's like, well, what's important now? We can't have like TikTok be the sacred, or our capacity to discern like what's missing, or what that batch is like a whole set of skills that'd be so great to say. Like some small towns do that. They have like the mayor is good at making mainstream feel sacred, and they make the city feel really homed and special. Like how can we find the palm tree needs to be sacred to Florida for the next 50 years so that we can rehome ourselves under its palmy umbrella or whatever.
It's a tricky thing because it can't be too top down, right? You have to have lots of experiments in the sacred generating and then upregulating, right? And then we filter it up to find ones that will actually work. But also the world is changing so quickly, we might not always have time to wait for that process, right? That the ancients it wasn't like some guy sat around and was like, I know Krishna, and then imposed that on his fellows. It took a long time to work out the vitality of the symbols. Do we have that amount of time? And how much can we do top-down interventions to create functional patterns of the sacred? How do we know who needs what kind of sacred at what time? And to what degree does somebody thinking they know for the others actually sabotage the process? So in order to break that conundrum. You need, I think, something like a socially recognized high status class of shamans, or something like Mircea Eliade called this shaman the technician of the sacred. Where are our technicians of the sacred? Where is that role recognized in the culture and empowered to make those decisions, rather than having those decisions default onto the crowd, or default onto the ruler, or default onto the artist, etc.?
What do you think about that, Bruce? Should there be a sacred class, like a secret elite that holds all the power to create the symbols for everybody? I love that, Layman.
I was just thinking about, I want to give a shout out to Brendan Graham Dempsey and his work. And, he's doing his metamodern spirituality, and he's got a book called Building the Cathedral. And he's really wrestling with this question of, can we fashion a new mythology for our time? And I remember many years ago, back in the 80s, I was reading the Dine Bahane of the Dine people, the Navajo people, and it was such a delightful cosmology and creation story, full of both profundity and outrageous, almost pornographic humor. I mean, it was just a crazy, crazy thing, but it really filled me up with the sense that I wish we had such a mythology for our unfolding narrative of the cosmos now, based on our own understanding. And I never did that. I think now Brian Swim and Thomas Berry and other people have been trying to do something like that. But my sense is people won't take it seriously in a way. If you just make it up and try to pass it down, there has to be this sense of what John calls inventio, or, Latour calls instauration. Some element of discovery of this thing. We recognize on some level, being postmodern or post-postmodern people, that there's an element of construction involved in what we're singling out. But I think without that element of discovery, of finding something that's erupting through and confronting us in a way that shows its own for itselfness, we can't take it seriously. Right. And so, Brian Swim is saying, for instance, and he's saying that science can play a role to be soul shaking. Scientists can play a role to be people who stir the interiors, as well as help. I think a lot of scientists, won't want to sit in that role. But he's saying maybe we need the poets of the sciences, in a way, somebody who can do that, where, how do we honor the first prokaryote, or the emergence of the first eukaryote? How do we honor the first stepping out onto the land from the sea of some creature that cocked its head up at the sun and blinked? And how do we memorialize those moments in a way that we connect to them in a feeling way? And again, I don't know exactly the answer. I think somebody, a class of people, just imposing it doesn't work. But I know that Layman wasn't suggesting that. But there's a
I think he was.
Maybe he was. Yeah, right. There's got to be people who are mediators, like shamans are mediators. They're people who are mediators who help us feel that we're making discoveries.
Yeah, I think there need to be specialists in this area, just like there are specialists in every other area, right? We expect somebody to be a good technician to build the space shuttle. We don't expect that anybody could do it, because some people have to put more time in and be driven by an instinct to want to explore those areas and gain skill in that area. And they don't need to be it's not a hierophantic superclass, but they do need to have cultural respect so that they can do their work, and that we listen to their expertise, which is a constant negotiation between what's coming up for everyone and what it seems like everyone needs, and how effective the production of the surplus experience of ontonormativity is actually going on in the tribe. There's a certain way, I think Bruce is correct. There's a lot of possibility. And Bobby Azarian, who's going to come and join us at the Metamodern Spirituality Retreat, this is what he wants to do, is a poetic attunement to the accumulated results of leading edge contemporary science. That's a beautiful idea, and that might provide, enhanced by, say, cognitive science, a theological rubric for a diverse way of encountering the divine around the planet. All right. And I look to the Vedic example because I think they were very good in saying, you can all keep your local gods, right? You worship this deity in this village, that's great. Just understand that that's part of the Trimurti of Vishnu and Brahma and Shiva. That's a version of this, and you can keep doing that version. So everybody can have their version. And that's not just important in order to reduce conflict between people, although that is important. It's crucial because the ritual enactment that instantiates the experience of the more than has to happen in your local circumstance. People have to do it together. They have to do it with nature. This is how it was anciently done. It can't just be we write it in a book and send everybody the book and they read it and believe it. It doesn't work that way. You have to go through the ritual experience. That means it has to be on site. It has to be in person to some degree, where we allow the unconscious through the process of the ritual to perform the constructivity, let's say, in a way that catches the conscious mind off guard as a discovery. But that's local, and that's going to be diverse. But we can have a kind of cognitive science and trans science poetry that might hold all of that for us.
Yeah, I love the poetry part and the myth part. Alicia Hararo's book on system dynamics, she talks about like origin stories. When you get rid of myth, that like mythopoetic, very human centric, like anthropomorphic origin story gets lost in scientific explanation, and it's like you lose time and space when you actually lose those little ritual events in some sense. When you have a purely descriptive analysis, you can say a lot of things, but you get kind of in this infinite regress without these rooted mythological kind of story structures, because stories ground time, space, and meaning in ways that descriptive explanations don't. And when the scientific worldview overtakes like the bad mythopoetic worldview, it loses time and space anchoring in the mythic. Like even like Kronos precedes Zeus and Hera, and then they precede all these other people that precede Hercules, that precedes your uncle, that precedes you. And it's grounded in a weird way. When you just say, well, time works this way and gravity works this way, you lose that kind of anchoring to origins that myths have. So it's really a paradox how to bring the mythopoetic back in while preserving the scientific explanatory, because they seem to want to dominate. Like scientists hate the myth. They don't want a myth. I loved what you were saying, Bruce. Like the myth of the fish that jumps onto land and sees the sunlight. You could have young kids or adults enact that mythically and participate in it in a drama, and then feel that they're a part of an important universe that's doing all this cool stuff. Yeah, and then I don't disagree. I kind of like the idea of a Hierophant priest class. How do we train people to like not disregard poetry, even to say poetry isn't about making things pretty, but it's actually about preserving the integrity of like these structures that are emergent. They're not just in our past, they're here as well.
I think we can start to look for people that have particular sets of attributes and bring them together into mutual recognition and see what can emerge from there in terms of a flexible set of expertise that can be used for this. But the problem with the hierophantic class is that it's bound up with too many proven failures in terms of hierarchical social organization structures. It's got to be much smarter and more fluid to exhibit any real collective intelligence. But I think one of the things this group should be good at, let's say, if we want to call it a group, is teaching the skill of poetic attunement to the aspects of reality that we confront. Right. So I have this riff on mythocolloquialism, which is to say we have the words the ancients had, right? We go, oh, they worshiped a god of war. Did they, or did they just have the word war like we do? We're like, war is coming, but we don't feel that poetically like it was an entity. But if we had more of that capacity to feel the evocative resonance, then it might very naturally grow into something like a myth that is appropriate to our experience. Likewise, I heard this week audio recordings, like gravitation waves from black holes turned into audio, right? And so, and it's this really high pitched kind of disturbing noise. So we talk about black holes, but we're also talking about screaming pits of ultimate darkness in the firmament, right? There's a way to poetically experience that. It's not saying that it's anything other than what science is saying it is, but somebody has to help us do that poetic attunement, out of which myth making can then grow rather than be imposed.
Two things I was thinking of. It first, out of that, that's so funny that you mentioned that, because last night, you know how they have those videos on YouTube that's like 10 hours of a box fan noise, fall asleep fast, you know? I was like thinking that we should make these 10-hour videos of like, confront Thulu fast. Here's 10 hours of a screaming black hole. Something like that.
Lovecraftian ASMR. These are the whispers of the void.
Yeah. What was the other thing? The other thing was with the, you know, the Hierophantic class cultivating some kind of poetic attunement. I was thinking of Michael Dowd and his distinction between night language and day language, and that we need both, and that we need to find ways to bring them into closer synergy, and that, you know, that we do have these elaborate day language descriptions of the universe, but there are ways to render them in night language that assist with poetic attunement to reality. And one way to think about it is, you know, I think, you know, there are reasons to be suspicious of how important story and myth is, and I think Layman brings out some of those things in some of his critiques. But one way to look at it, and this is the way that I've appreciated from systems thinkers, is that stories give us an embodied feel for the inside of systems, that the outside day language gives us the description of reality, and the story helps us feel that description in a more embodied and immediate way. It can give us an intuitive sense to a multidimensional reality that's hard to lay out in, you know, clear third-person descriptive language.
Yeah, I think that again speaks to the validity of the Christian Neoplatonists really focusing on this notion of God as a kind of poetic character who occupies the space of complexity, the space of the convergence of all the limits of our knowing, but as if it was something we could understand, something we could feel about, something we could deal with in terms of our human emotional capacity.
Yeah, I've never really thought about the way you're saying this poetic attunement function, and I've always liked like the Song of Roland, or those early like Mesopotamian kind of origin stories like Gilgamesh, because they do home you in a larger than life way that makes life exciting, but also in a way that like it teaches you how to relate to things like your mortality or women or your subservience to culture at large, or your weakness as a king, or things like that these stories can do in a way that just like pointing it out and saying, oh, you should be more humble, king, because other kings that aren't humble, they always fall. But this kind of like, yeah, how to recover like music and entertainment and poetry from pop culture in such a way that it teaches people to like live more enchanted lives, or attuned to the enchantment that's around them. So yeah, it's, John doesn't talk a lot about that directly, but in his examples and in his thinking, he definitely does indirectly, like these Christians, like Nicholas Acusa is, I mean, he has the learned ignorance treatise, which is amazing and beautiful and unique in a lot of ways. But it also, like, he reinterprets a lot of the Old Testament for Christians in this much more erotic, alive way, that allows people that can access his writings to go, oh wow, I never looked at that passage the same way. Kind of like what Jordan Peterson does, but obviously he's kind of an imperfect human to be a moral good in the world. But like, you know, I don't think we have quite. Nicholas was a much simpler fella, I suppose, than Jordan. And you can buy into what he's saying in a sense, because he's both got this kind of mythopoetic genius, and he bridges it into allegory, into history, into these different dimensions of cognition. Yeah, so I love this. This is really thought-provoking. I almost wish John would have like a 5-part poetry course on how to like make the world sing. Like I guess Iamblichus does that. Have either of you read much of Iamblichus or any of the Platonists that are into the gods?
I want to say on that topic, like that transition, I think is the place we want to go from this series. Like one of the best things John said in the last couple episodes is brushing your teeth is not a ritual. Now he's trying to make a distinction there between these specific modes of ritual that allow us to do this experiential, existential inquiry into the natural world, and highlight and refine our capacity to do sense making between knowing and being. That's fantastic. But there's this other ritual, which is just to participate in the world, just to be in your society is a ritual machinery as well. And the question is, how does brushing your teeth move from not being a part of or that ritual to being a part of that ritual? How do we make that little transition between our everyday activities and some level of poetry at which our activities and everyone else's activities can merge together to be the background container ritual within which we periodically do the specific instantiated rituals? How does the person who likes to barbecue when summer starts realize that they are in fact a sun worshiper and then feel that accordingly? Right? You may have this hierophantic class or whatever we're calling it. They might be specialists in being able to practice and deploy the skill of poetic attunement. But for everyone else, they might need story, they might need poetry. It's something to activate them emotionally and teach them that what they're doing actually has a sacred dimension, even if it's not the full ritual enactment. It's part of the greater ritual enactment.
I think Thich Nhat Hanh would disagree with John that brushing your teeth is not a ritual. But I'm joking with that. But Thich Nhat Hanh is trying to say basically anything like that can become ritual with the right presence of mind, pretty much. But yeah, of course, John's point is well taken, that just the repetitive doing of something every day, that in itself is not ritual, and that's this deadening repetition. So I think one of the things that he brings up both in our conversation with him and in this series is, what do we need within ritual? What elements allow it to be transferable to other contexts? And I think there are things that we can find within the ritual itself that allow it to be transported out. But I think also there's a role for this, whatever we're calling the hierophants, the metamodern hierophants, who actually help to translate in a way that you can recognize what's happening in the ritual in other dimensions of your life and make that connection, make that translative connection, so that you can have some kind of scaffolding that supports the recognition of the value that's generated in the ritual space in other contexts.
Yeah, the transfer part is tricky. I mean, I studied transfer quite a bit in graduate school, and it's like people are very bad at transfer. You could teach someone a solution to a problem that is completely analogous to another problem they have, and like 90% of people will not transfer that knowledge that they were just given, as an example. So we're very bad at that as a species. we're great at copying, right? We over copy compared to the other great apes and the other primates and things like that. But we also just fail to transfer subtly sometimes because we don't notice the underlying patterns that the features are distorting or hiding in their specificity. So finding ways to do that is again, yeah, I love this idea of like a poet that goes around telling people you're a sun god. You don't even realize that at the grill. Or like when I first started teaching, I remember looking up, there's like a centaur that the Greeks thought was like a great teacher. He was kind of like wasn't a god, but he was like more elevated than the average person. And I was like, oh, how cool is it that I could read about this, any myths about this educator archetype, and maybe glean some insights on how to be a better educator or what education meant. And yeah, finding figures and stories and embodied practices that both reveal and connect, but also like shine out into the rest of your life so that you're not living in this kind of like detached nihilism 75% of your day and then this like ecstatic beauty 25% of your day or something. And I think that's where, like, when you say, Bruce, all these beautiful religions and practices you've done, it's so hard to transfer into like the Western world because you just can't relate these inner experiences to a stranger that you meet on the street. You go, oh, I would, like you were saying, Layman, like really you want to feel reverence regardless of religion or not. Like if you start to have reverence in your life and start to have respect and elevation, it doesn't matter if it comes from religion or not. But how do we do that in a way that isn't just cool esotericism that can get you up to that amazing spot, but then also that transfers into a practicality that can then reinforce each other. Rather, you can almost feel more alienated sometimes when you have these awesome non-dual or these really deep psychedelic, I don't know anything about these psychedelic things, but like these kind of things, and then you're like, oh, where does that in the real world? Where is that in like the rest of my experience? So that's another bridge besides just the skillfulness of the people that needs to be made.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, that's another place where you need the hierophants, or I'd probably rather call them gardeners or something like that, right? Somebody who takes care and has a discourse around how you need to process these things. So you're not just isolating and quarantining them. But I think a big part of that is multimodality, right? So if you learn something and you can reproduce it and you can dance it and you can make a picture of it, or you learn it in 4 different seasons, that the generic transferability of your ability to work with those patterns increases dramatically, right? So one of the things ritual does, and I think one of the main things that allows us to generate access to the more than the hyperphatic suchness, is by combining different systems within ourselves. Right? If you have a mental appreciation of it that you're working on, and you have an emotional appreciation, and you have a somatic appreciation, and you have a performative enactment appreciation, as these start to blend together, then it becomes something that's much more transferable to other aspects of your life. It ceases to be just knowledge and becomes understanding as a generic capacity, and that's when it starts to be, performative wisdom in the good sense of performative.
I think we need meta-modern tune-up masters. Oh, you need a poetic tune-up. But I was thinking, actually, just as an aside, but it's an interesting thing. The Koch brothers, right? And they're kind of famous conservative people who are well known for trying to influence culture through narrative and insertion of different kinds of, narrative tropes and other kinds of things into society to serve certain political ends. And Elizabeth Koch, I think, is the granddaughter, and she's created this business called Perception Box. And pretty much, it sounds like, one, she's trying to kind of redeem herself for what she conceives of as the misdeeds of her grandfather, but she's created a business which basically is kind of this. It is it's aimed at people to really help them understand what is the kind of story they inhabit, what is the way that the story that they inhabit is deadening their opportunities, and what are shifts that you can make in your perception box that actually radically reorients the world, that can revitalize you and help you to be a transformative agent in the world. So it's an interesting experiment. And I mean, I don't know anything about it. I've not done it. Apparently, you don't pay for it, I think. You apply and then they give you money in order to go through the process. That's what it sounds like to me. But to me, that seems like, a function kind of like we're talking about, where it is working at this level with people, with their meaning systems, and finding out where are the dysfunctions in the meaning making system, and that are both individual, but that are also results of the dysfunctional meaning system of the culture. And how do you do some kind of authentic reclamation of perspective, through internal story processing work?
Yeah, that's really cool. That I would love like a poet therapist that's like, you don't talk about your mom. They just go, oh, I see the sun. You mean that glowing sphere of 100 million temperature, blasting its rays billions of miles across? They're like, oh yeah, into the boring blue sky. You mean the 8 billion cubic tons of hydrogen that have produced more breaths of air for human beings across? Yeah, like something about reclaiming that poetic capacity, and then even doing it together. Like my friend Cheryl Zhu, who's been on John's channel a couple of times, she goes to these retreats and they're just super creative. They're just doing all this imaginal, creative brainstorming, and sometimes like stories emerge, and sometimes real kind of meaning, collective meaning emerges from those practices, and like starting to figure out how to generate collective meaning in an authentic way, and maybe how to like learn to deal with bullshit. I know that's another great word of John's. Like, he didn't really mention these episodes, but the idea of like perennial bullshit happening, kind of clouding up your meaning making, is the other side of that coin. And yeah, I love this. Some kind of therapist of poetry, like a poet therapist, could be really, and especially training that stuff to groups, right? Because it's not like you just want to individualistically grow. You want to communally have this stuff showing up. And how could you have like a 5th grade teacher generate like a drama of the class, or of a we used to have to like swish this little fluoride, and they like make it exciting, somehow make it meaningfully exciting. And you're like, oh, I can't wait till Tuesday when we all stand around the edge of a concrete thing and spit into the grass or whatever it was, because it had this kind of imaginative value to our little minds that the teacher kind of co-generated with us. And yeah, so and I guess we've talked about this topic quite a bit. Is there I don't want to miss out too much on some of like the cognitive grammar stuff that you were interested in, Bruce, or other aspects, Layman, of any of these episodes. Or we could just stick with ritual.
What stands out to me is when John was talking about the apophatic and the cataphatic, which is a classic distinction, and then this author who had used the term hyperphatic to describe Ariogena's, stereoscopic seeing through, accessing God as the more than, what I would call the integrative surplus, the extra ontological depth. John slipped up and said hypophatic at one point and then corrected himself. So then I was thinking, okay, what's the hypophatic in this sense? Right. And I thought, well, this is where I think about the adjacency a lot, because I'm thinking a lot about how do things integrate to create these surpluses that we then have these interactions with. Even if in interacting we experience them as primordial simplicities, we actually had a role in co-creating and constructing them. But in order for things to be co-created and constructed, there has to be a space in which the relating can happen. There has to be intermediary space already. And maybe that's the hypophatic, right? That there's a not quite, there's an almost, right? It's not an insufficiency, but it's different than more than. It's the not quite that allows the space in which things can come together, in which a more than could be produced. If there's a sweet spot threshold at which more than explodes, that's because a not quite enabled that space to occur. So I think there is an important role for the hypophatic, even though it was a slip of the tongue within the video.
In the course I'm doing right now on the development of the senses, and relating that to David Bohm's notion of the rheosoma, the flowing body, and the holosoma, the whole body that is part of this implicate enfolding of the layered, leveled reality. There's a concept that comes from a couple places. In South America, there's a tribe that says that if you are able to sit on your stool, there's a little stool that they use out in the jungle. If you're able to sit on the stool with enough stillness, you can hear the echo from every object. And usually it's only the shaman class that can really hear the echo that comes from every object. But their sense of the echo from every object is a attunement to both the not quiteness and the moreness of every object. It's not simply what it appears to ordinary distracted perception, but it has this ontic indefinity around it, that if you can tune into that, there's a power in that. And they recognize that as a sacred thing. And so that connects to Merleau-Ponty. And Merleau-Ponty talks about also the echo, being able to hear the echo, and that echo can point you to the intertwining, towards the chiasm, towards the moreness and the not quiteness of things, that things are not just identical with themselves, but there's an entanglement of everything and everything. And the echo is a decentering of our ontology if you really begin to attend to the echo. And he says even temporally, we can get that, where every feeling of a present moment enfolds within it its immediate past that's not objectified, but that is informing the present. And every present moment enfolds the immediate future that's not objectified. And those enfolded immediate past and present have their own past and present, so that actually there's a sense of an echoing fullness to every single moment that gathers up. It's a sonic or visual or other kinds of gathering of the fullness in the not quiteness and the moreness, right? So I think this kind of narrative that Layman is talking about with adjacency can be grounded in very particular ways of, like, how do we cultivate and use our senses, and that we have rich lineages both within phenomenology that can help us do that, but also Zen, to hear the sound, the bell ring before it's sounded, or the shamanic capacity of sitting on your stool and hearing the echo of every object. I think there's something that we can recapture there that gets at some of what we've been exploring here, and what Layman was just getting at with adjacency.
Love the phrase decentralized ontology. And it's sort of the same thing that John's calling salience Gansfield. And I think it's strikes me as essential to what I'm doing in the course that's starting on Sunday with masculine and feminine is, yeah, we're going to play with what their identities are, but really it's switching back and forth with them to the point where you feel a decentering in your own relationship relative to them. That's the sweet spot where it becomes useful to you as a being. Well, there's another thing, actually, I was thinking about watching the last episode of John, and not just because I love saying xenon volition, but the finsting concept is great. And I think it's important to have recognition for the fact that there's a metacognitive layer involved in having that discussion, right? We're looking at this thing, go, okay, there's this almost protological form of gestural communication, right? That in order for me to say this is a rock, I have to first be able to go, it's a this, right? So it seems like that's more primordial, and we can assume that, but that's a retroactive assumption, because when we're in the moment of that contemplation, we're adding another layer. We're doing the work of teasing apart the conceptual from the gestural in that moment, right? That just to think of finsting is not, we're not primarily aware of finsting. We primarily finst, but to be aware of finsting is a more complex cognitive operation. So I think it's important to keep that in the discussion and not think that we're simply recovering a simpler and more primordial dimension. We're also adding a layer which allows us to do that. We're building complexity in that gesture as well.
Yeah, I love the finsting stuff. It's very indexicality and demonstrative reference are like, it's weird that our brains do that and we're not actively aware of it. It just kind of is happening all the time. And yeah, when John said like God was like the mysterious like mega finst at some point, he kind of implied that there was like I could have this concept of God, and it's really just pointing at all these mysterious things that I can't quite grasp with my consciousness very well. And so it's serving this very important function as like a placeholder for mystery, allowing mystery to then get pointed at later by me. And it's interesting too, because like when you point at something and label it, it loses its moreness. And so it's very subtle when you start to say, oh, that's, you could, like a materialist, right, can say, oh, I can turn that into lumber. I can turn that into, air at the hospital. I can sell people all the sand. I can color and put it in bottles and sell to tourists. And you're just really using your indexicality to label everything in your environment a certain way in relationship to yourself. And then if you can learn to do that more flexibly or realize other people are doing it a little better, then it really opens up a lot of capacity to say like, oh, when that person is acting that way, they're really being indexical in a certain way that they're almost like blinding themselves in their like the way John talks about the 9-dot problem. It's like as soon as you label it as a box in your mind, you've finsted it as a box and you're stuck in the wrong view. So understanding these things, like what if our conception of God is just a really subtle cognitive phenomenon that we're misapprehending. So yeah, the finsting part was really, really cool.
So this meta level, I think, is essential in this discussion because fundamentally you could say, like Bruce was saying about sensory perception, right? There's this not quite and more than. There's a certain kind of vagueness built in where we have free experience of things rather than block them off and pretend that they don't fall on either side of the lines we've created. And that seems to be a very natural human capacity when humans are healthy and unfolding in a normal way. But what humans are not great at is figuring out when they're being healthy and when they're not being healthy. And so you get whole systems built up out of people who originally had that unspoken capacity, and they can't find their way back. So that's why you need this meta layer of being able to look at how these things operate so we can tease apart these underlying capacities from the things that get in the way. Right. So it's not enough to go back because when we go back, we conflate what's natural and what's artificial. We need to go forward in a way where we can make that distinction.
I think I only got about 20 minutes into his very last video, so I didn't hear the part about the finsting, but I look forward to that. Now, I know Charles Sanders Peirce, has some pretty interesting reflections on indexicality and the role that plays in our semiotics. And I was just thinking from what you were describing, because again, it's resonant with things that I'm exploring on different contexts, but the Heideggerian notion between Vorhandenheit and Zuhandenheit, the present at hand and the ready to hand. And there's been an assumption, especially in Western metaphysics, that exhausts what beings are for us. That either things are what they are instrumentally for us, the ready-to-handedness, in which case they just are absorbed into our projects and our extensions of ourselves in relationship to a project, and they're just unconsciously enfolded in that. Or they stand apart from us in their in itselfness, and then we attempt to grasp them theoretically and metaphysically and have some kind of full cognitive perception of them. And neither of those really gets at this this moreness and lessness of things. You need something like Gelassenheit, this form of just letting go and letting be, to discover the always already that never yet was. And it's that discovering the always already that never yet was, that's actually that extra layer of complexity, I feel, that Layman was just talking about, in the retrieval of that dimensionality of the being. You're actually, while you're maybe touching a more primordial experience of participation in things, it's being evoked in a way that has never yet really inhabited you in a conscious way until you're able to make that apprehension.
Yeah, so could you say that again, Bruce, a little bit? Like, what it's a it's a receding, that's a presencing, that's got a flexibility in its being.
Yeah, the Heidegger and Derrida and others have critiqued the whole metaphysics of presence. And one of the ideas around the metaphysics of presence is that things are what they are, and that we can have an unambiguous grasp of them, especially if you do rigorous enough thinking. You can grasp their essence and capture it. And that's what a lot of the metaphysical project has been about, is to grasp things in that way. And so with Heidegger, with his whole with his wanting to destruct metaphysics, or Derrida with his deconstruction and wanting to decenter us, to show that we don't have full possession of things. We don't even have full possession of ourselves. So that's a critique of metaphysics of presence. But you can argue that there's a concept of presence within Heidegger called Anwesenheit, and that is this presence that actually allows things to alethically unfold by letting go and letting be. It's a participatory mode of access to the thing that is not the theoretical grasping, and it's not the instrumental use. So yeah, that's kind of where I was coming from.
Oh, that's very helpful. Yeah, because I think, like, in terms of nature, a lot of times I try to get out of the way of an event and then see the truth of it by not interacting with it. So yeah, that makes way more sense.
Yeah, and all of that is good. It's good language of training, and it has to be used carefully when it's language of explaining, right? If it's like, how do I get out of the way and not interact with it? Well, I'm actually still going to be there doing something, interacting with it, but I want to do that in such a way that it seems to me like I'm getting out of the way and letting it unfold. So it's in some ways a more complex operation that I'm doing at the level of explanation. But at the level of how do you do it, it's do less.
Well, it's interesting, John, I think in 13 or maybe 14, he describes like two people conversing about reality as like almost the most real thing, because there's an extra level of honesty, or like a level of bullshitting I have to discard with you two, that I can actually like not discard when I'm alone. So I can be bullshitting myself all the time, but if I want to have an authentic moment with the two of you, I need to show up with an integrity, and then both of you do, and then the three of us are actually like participating in a view of reality that we're all trying to show up honestly at. So it's almost like the realist human moment is when two people are dialoguing about life, whatever it is. I thought that was a really interesting point because it kind of salvages subjectivity in some sense, because the transjective, you have to always kind of get rid of the subjective to have the transjective be as fully present as it could be. But if part of transjectivity is two subjects co attending to some third thing with an authenticity that requires like intent and communication, then there's something like really profound just about being with another person and sharing a view, which I thought was like it shocked me a little bit, because John is, it's so easy to be like in this detached point of view where it's like, oh, John's meta theory will explain everything, but it's like, oh, actually you need people in dialogue to kind of co-generate an honest moment that they can experience together, which I don't know, I just find that beautiful.
I
Oh,
agree.
yeah.
Even laughter, right? Like right now we're all laughing at the awkwardness of like building up to a, it has to be dialectic, and then like there's nowhere to talk about after that. But even like it's hard to laugh without being either very self-aware or sharing a moment that you had to kind of participate in. Which again, it's like, oh, that's awesome. Because then being with your grandparents is really real, or being with your kids is really real, or your best friend. It doesn't have to be this, well, it's only real if you go down to Jerusalem and you let yourself get crucified, and then a story is told about you or something like that. Like I just thought that was really cool. I don't know if that jumped out to either of you.
Mhm.
I think that's the center of all John's work in a way. That's why he's bringing forward these thinkers who have said things like this. But what he and all of these thinkers have in common is the diversity of ways in which that's happening, right? It's happening in the direct philosophical dialogue. It's also happening in every relational exchange in your life. It's also happening between you and the world all the time, right? So that the dialogical dynamics describe this entire set of affairs. If I'm laughing when I'm alone, it's only because I'm actually not alone. There is another thing keeping me in check. It's the world.
Well, it's so beautiful because it's so intimate. It puts, one of the things I hate about a lot of the like, not meta modern, but just this kind of philosophy next to this part of the internet, is that it pulls me out of the equation and makes me almost irrelevant. Whereas like that kind of co-creative, participatory, like it requires actually like honesty as a virtue and courage as a virtue. When those things come to the fore, it's like, oh, there's a, like intimacy takes on this whole central dimension to our lives that kind of nihilist postmodern materialism is like, ah, you're just 180 pounds of carbon that's going to be filled in a coffin one day, and then you'll be part of the giant mass of carbon that is floating around the sun in a boring way. But when it's like, oh, we have to be intimate together with integrity to create goodness, and it's like, oh wow, I can participate in that every day, like all the time, or in a history class, or in a engineering becomes like this intimate projection of all engineers' thoughts in history, that you're participating in a tradition rather than some information machine getting like bits put into you or something.
Well, that's why you need it's more important to have gardeners than it is to have a new narrative in terms of generating the poetic and mythic dimension for the planetary system. It's not like narrative has no role, but it has to be intimately co-enacted, right? So what's important is the understanding set that helps people to do that procedure, out of which they access this dimension. And it's only a little bit important to try to figure out the stories that we should give people that will draw them toward that, because it's actually in our intimacies that we find it.
Yeah, it flips the meta narrative quite a bit when you, the way you're saying it, Layman. That's pretty cool. Because we're not missing a meta narrative, we're missing the capacity to be the people that could create what might turn into a meta narrative.
Yeah.
I think that's an important part of what Sloterdijk has been up to with his work, especially in the Spheres trilogy, and really looking, there's a kind of depersonalized way that philosophy has turned, and especially, focusing on time with Heidegger, and Sloterdijk is wanting to reclaim and revalue a focus on a philosophy of space. But in this case, what it is, these are spaces of intimacy. There are different kinds of spheres of intimacy, and that there is a space when there is this dialogical encounter and unfolding. So there's the desire to emphasize that even the infant in the womb is a dialogical being going through this process of relating and unfolding with the uterus, and with the placenta and with the mother's voice, and these are different from the most intimate sphere all the way out, and he's got these different notions of like the uterotop and the chirotop, and chirotop meaning that the sphere of the hand, but what's the sphere of the things that we do by hand that bring us together person to person, and what's made between us, and how do we show up authentically in those places. But one of the things that's, I think interesting about what he's pointing at that maybe we haven't really evoked here is his concept of co-immunism, and this sense that we need, in a way, to find ways of relating and to tell stories and to create rituals that help immunize us against the pressing impersonality of being that could have a destructive influence on us. Like we have an atmosphere, a very thin atmosphere that protects us from the vacuum of space, that without that protecting sphere, there is no life. So it immunizes us from the vacuum, right? And that a lot of our social practices and ritual practices are creating these immunological zones where we can take in the threat in a way that maybe can be transformative for us, but doesn't destroy us. How can you host otherness in a way with the skill that allows you to incorporate that and metabolize that and transform and deepen, rather than just being infected by it that destroys the system?
Yeah, there's not a sufficient amount of attention being paid to what and how we filter things out. So the cabin retreat I was just at prior to my back injury on the ice was extraordinarily evocative and productive. And in large part, that's because of all the things from regular life, and especially the devices that were not at play in that space. We were co-immunizing ourselves against many things in order to create the arena in which this other form of attunement can come forward.
Yeah, the niche construction aspect of ritual and some of the kind of participatory knowing that John's talking about is tricky, because all the niches that house the sacred from the past 500 years even are mostly falling short in our lives, and how to reattune or regenerate those capacities, or find ways to connect to this reality, whether it's perceptual or conceptual.
we see the characters like the ancient figure of the whatever we're calling them, the hierophantic gardeners, right? That the role of being unconventional, the role of being the hiyuka or the trickster or something like that in classic indigenous cultures, one of the things that indicates is that the people who are training in this skill set are doing a playful, semi-arbitrary relinquishing of normal phenomenon. I'm not going to dress appropriately for the village. I'm putting some things across a membrane to experimentally figure out how these spaces open up, first for myself and later for the village once I've mastered some of that capacity.
I like these hierophant gardener poets that we need to find. There probably one just walked by my road. I was just on this Zoom call accidentally instead. Yeah, I hope John, because this is all in like the artistic kind of realm in some sense. There's a lot of like, I don't know. I loved John's first episode on shamanism in his original series. I've watched it a couple times, and I feel like Plotinus is kind of a shaman. Proclus is 100% a shaman. Iamblichus is 100%. Even Socrates, in some senses, like bridging historically, like the time of shamanism.
He says that. He says he's a seer, right? He's like,
right.
He's an amateur seer. He does it enough to get by.
Right. Yeah. Right. A part-time shaman. Yeah. I work at Wendy's Tuesday, Thursday, and then Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I'm shamaning down at the beach. Yeah, no, he is though. Yeah, he's even in the dream world, and they're in the like cataphatic vision world. Yeah, it's a lot to think about there. I don't want to hold this too long because I know we kind of have tons of episodes to talk about. Maybe we'll kind of wrap up and then we can bring some of this into the next weeks if we want, if there was other parts that we didn't talk about. Bruce, do you have any more good ideas about our poet, gardener, hierophant type of person that needs to exist in the 21st century to save us from our own undoing?
I don't know if I do, but in a paper that Layman and I kind of put together, another friend too, Edward Berge, put together, I floated the idea of people who lower these metallophones into the ocean and sound them in particular ways that causes the whales to come and assemble. And there are people who are experimenting with interspecies communications, but what kind of structures that can we build, generative enclosures, what kind of creative, artistic, ritualized story spaces that are playful, that are boundary transgressive, and yet also co-immunizing, that when sounded have the potential to summon the whales from the deep. In other words, encounters with the presences of being that exceed us and surprise us. That's an image I like, and I'd like to play with that. I remember also, just as a boy, I loved all kinds of fantasy novels, but for some reason I was attracted to the fantasy novels that had a bard in them, the ones who could sing the stories that energized the people, but that had an insight into things that could allow for cognitive shifts for the people in the story. So yeah, just all that's present for me. I don't know if I have anything deep to say about it, but I like the evocativeness of those things.
I think to some degree that's what we're all doing, right? We're all in networks of people who could be these gardeners, and we're all doing projects that call these whales forth. Right? The course I'm starting in a couple of days, yes, I will be guiding people through a stereoscopic seeing through of masculine and feminine practices related to that and how to frame it in a metamorphic sense. But really, it's a convening of people who I think probably have the capacity to play a role in this garden or hierophantic function going forward. And I want them to see each other and get better at what it is that they do. And I think almost everything I do has that function.
And now I want to dangle like a bunch of acoustic equipment near John's house and see what will attract him.
He's pressed up at the window.
Yeah, John's just like, I heard this one note. It was a heartbeat of a wombat in the womb, and I couldn't not go towards it. It was like the chocolate cake.
Turn on the John Vervaeke signal.
Exactly. And then all of a sudden the world is more meaningful. And yeah, no, but this is the trickster motive that you guys were kind of hinting at a couple of times is really profound in the Jungian sense, right? When all the other roles can't hold the gold, there's at least this trickster that can kind of play with things and start to make sense of what couldn't be said or what isn't being talked about or a way that hasn't been kind of tread. Yeah, I think this is I want to start practicing. I'm going to go to the graduate school, find this Hierophant graduate school that I can start to, I don't know, I could sacrifice some bulls. Maybe we could write a poem to, the god of pollution or something like that, or some.
Let's say 90% of my new course is bull sacrifice. I'm just
Yeah, fantastic. That's really the skill missing in my life right now. So
just totally randomly, I would kind of like John to grow out his beard. I have a suspicion that if he did, he might look pretty much like Socrates. I sometimes see that image from the cover of the video, and then he comes on, and there's actually a similar facial construction. If he took off his glasses, and I think we'd be beholding Socrates right there.
I do expect him to be wearing togas when I see him.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's year 2 of the Vervaeke Foundation when we start having John wear togas, and it's only chariots. The whole project slows way down off of North America because how do you get a chariot to Europe? But yeah,
we gotta co-immunize each other against the Taoist car god.
See, it's coming full circle. It's a great conversation here.
Yeah, the cognitive grammar we've generated to solve the meaning crisis, I believe we've created more intelligibility in this hour and a half than probably anyone's ever done in the history of time.
Yeah.
So